This is not a hit piece, art is subjective. Once again, this is not a hit piece and art is subjective. With that said, wrestling criticism is completely broken. We all know here in the online wrestling space that there's only one set of match ratings that anybody looks out for, whether it's to heartily agree with them or heartily disagree with them or just to see what they are. And that person, of course, the biggest wrestling critic, is Dave Meltzer, and he's been doing this for literally decades. But it's a weird role for him, in my opinion. And what I mean by that is, being a critic is not his primary role at all. Meltzer is wrestling's biggest and most long successful historian. He's also probably its biggest and most long successful reporter. But then he's also wrestling's biggest critic as well, as I say. And that's where I think things get weird. Unlike other art forms like music or film, which have lots of different ratings from lots of different sources, wrestling match ratings are basically a monopoly. I'm not saying that Dave Meltzer wants it to be that way, I'm just saying that is the way it is. And that's partly because things like wrestling and film are gigantic compared to wrestling, so of course you've got a much bigger pool of people critiquing those things. But I also think it's worth mentioning that wrestling criticism, in my view, is so behind the times. It's so antiquated. We are basically in the dinosaur age of wrestling criticism still. And when we explore this, I think it's because, if we're being brutally honest, the man who gives out wrestling's most headline-grabbing ratings has a reasoning that I feel is deeply flawed. And I just want to be very clear, I'm not saying that his ratings themselves are objectively flawed. That is impossible. Everybody can have their own view on how good or how bad a wrestling match is, and Dave is one of those people. I wouldn't be sat here making this video if it was all just about how I disagreed with one person's match ratings. And I also think that it's impossible for anybody to agree with any other person's match ratings 100% of the time. But I think that the reasoning behind Meltzer's ratings is flawed. Not the ratings themselves necessarily, but the reasoning behind them I feel certainly is. And in turn, I think that shows us how limited wrestling criticism is. Which again, isn't Meltzer's fault. He's just the big dog. It's not his fault that nobody pays much attention to the other critical dogs. A quick disclaimer, in this video I'm about to talk a lot more about Dave Meltzer's opinions, and it's great that he has these opinions and he is allowed to have them. And I'm also going to express my own opinions, and I'm allowed to have those too, but that does not mean that I have a personal issue with the man Dave Meltzer. One final time, this is not a hit piece, and art is subjective. Now let's go. Breaking rocks in the I fought the law and the law, I fought the law. No, I'm just kidding, I'm just being a silly Billy. I appreciate Dave Meltzer. I probably wouldn't have the job that I do were it not for Dave Meltzer at some point down the line. Now, I'm going to frame most of this video essay around two particular matches from the past, both of which got a notoriously low number of stars compared to kind of general opinion, and both of which are therefore remembered as kind of criminally underrated by Dave. The first one is, of course, the thumbnail of this very video and one of the biggest intergenerational dream matches of all time throughout wrestling history, The Rock versus Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 18. It got 3 stars from Dave. And in a complete vacuum, yes, maybe it would have been a 3-star match. The action's pretty basic, it's a little bit clunky at times, but there are also dramatic swings in momentum and big false finishes and all that kind of stuff. So on balance, 3 stars may well seem fair, or even maybe a little bit generous, if you watched this match on mute and you couldn't see the crowd and you had no idea about the context or the history of the people involved in the bout. But of course, The Rock versus Hulk Hogan doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is a previously unthinkable dream match between two of the biggest stars in wrestling history, one at the peak of his powers and the other one representing the old guard, and it results in one of the hottest crowds I think we've ever seen. It also features what many now believe to be a legendary piece of improvisation, with both men in the ring leaning into the crowd's near unanimous support for Hogan, who was a heel going into the match, and The Rock therefore healing it up instead as the match goes on. And we have to remember that Hogan turns face after the match anyway, helping The Rock fight off an attack from his NWO stablemates and turning face in the process, shaking The Rock's hand and everything. But the fact that they jump-started this in the match itself is generally considered to be, this legendary bit of improv. Now, I don't want to judge anybody's method of evaluating a wrestling match. We all do it in different ways. Maybe you go purely on vibes, where you just think about how the match makes you feel at that time. Maybe you break it down into distinct categories, like the crowd reaction, the ring work, etc., etc. Or maybe you're a bit more like me, and you try to consider the match as a whole thing, where these categories are kind of inextricable from one another, and so the match exists as its own independent one singular thing. But by whichever metric you like to judge a wrestling match, I think most people would agree that The Rock versus Hogan absolutely delivers on its potential. It's a moment, it's a thrill ride, it's a spectacle, it's been remembered for 2 decades plus, and it'll be remembered for more in the future as well. And that's why Dave's 3-star rating has kind of lived on in infamy. So why did Meltzer give this match such a pedestrian star rating? I think there's various possible reasons here, or a combination of those reasons. First of all, and I think this is the reason that would most instantly spring to mind for most people when trying to work out this kind of weird little mystery, a matter of personal preference in terms of style. You could argue, and many people do, that Meltzer typically values work rate over the other elements that are more central to making this match such a great one. And this apparent preference of Meltzer's is of course where we get the famous 5 stars in the Tokyo Dome joke among the online wrestling community. And I don't know who came up with that joke first, but man, congratulations to you, it has had some staying power. And if you don't know what I'm referring to, basically Japanese wrestling, for better or worse, depending on who you ask, is kind of stereotypically thought of as action over storytelling, even though once again, I would argue you can't really separate those two things so neatly, or at least as neatly as many people do. So the joke is that Dave Meltzer, who at various stages of his career seems to have enjoyed Japanese wrestling the most, is biased in its favour and would therefore have given an otherwise deserving match 5 stars if only it had taken place in the Tokyo Dome. And for those who kind of most vehemently dislike Meltzer's way of doing things, I have to admit there was a particular bit of good fortune this year in the form of Hiroshi Tanahashi's retirement match against Kazuchika Okada at Wrestle Kingdom. This match features an aging legend whose work isn't nearly as smooth as it used to be, and it seems to thrive more on the star quality of the two men involved and their shared history and this just grand sense of occasion as the match is taking place. And in a thematic sense, you could definitely say that it is in some way comparable to Hogan versus Rock. And Meltzer gave it 6 stars out of 5. And it took place in the Tokyo Dome. But I digress. Back to Rock versus Hogan at WrestleMania 18. And back to talking about why Meltzer rated this match only 3 stars out of 5. So there's one particular reason. An apparent preference for a different style of great match over this one. But there's another reason that I think springs pretty quickly to mind as well, if you're familiar with the history of Dave Meltzer's star ratings, and that is that Meltzer might have just been a harsher critic back in the early 2000s. And I think that's pretty inarguably true, actually. And I also think that in the time since then, modern wrestling has become a lot more centered around what Meltzer in particular seems to prefer. He has said publicly before that modern mainstream wrestling is better than it ever has been in the past, and his ratings reflect that. The earliest match cited as a 5-star Dave Meltzer match was Ric Flair versus Butch Reed in 1982, and by the turn of the century, he had awarded 91 matches the maximum rating. So we're at the beginning of the 21st century now, the year 2000, and there are 91 5-star matches. And then we fast forward another decade to the start of the 2010s, and obviously that number of 91 had increased. To 98, across the total decade of the noughties, according to Dave Meltzer, there were only 7 5-star matches. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing on its own necessarily. In fact, I actually think it would have been quite cool if this had been consistent all the way through Meltzer's history of star ratings. If 5-star matches had been actually very, very rare all of the time, it would make each one feel a lot more special. But compared to his output before this in the 80s and 90s, and compared especially to his output since in the 2010s and the 2020s so far, 7 5-star matches in a decade is crazy. Like, it's so stingy, especially when you consider that that decade featured the rise of indie wrestling in North America with Ring of Honor, the rise of the X Division in TNA, for example, as well. Over in Japan, you had Noah bursting onto the scene with some of these incredible matches. You also had, if you want to keep things super, super mainstream, you had some WrestleMania matches commonly considered to be some of the best Mania matches of all time. Infamously, of course, Meltzer did not give 5 stars to the WrestleMania 25 match between The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels, but that's just his most, I think, notorious example. There are many, many other examples of wrestling matches across the whole decade of the noughties which, in the minds of many, many wrestling fans, are better than a lot of the matches that get awarded 5 stars today. So on one hand, we're being told that wrestling is better than it ever has been in the past, implying some kind of radical development, radical evolution over the years. I mean, this would naturally lead you to assume that each decade would feature more 5-star rated matches than the one previous. And that is true now. Like in the 2020s already, Meltzer has awarded over double the amount of 5-star matches that they were in the 2010s. And there's still like 3 years of this decade left. But then on the other hand, the whole decade of the 2000s is this massive, inexplicable dip. And that really just doesn't compute for me. And this is where I get really frustrated. Again, not with Meltzer as a person with his own opinions, of course not, but with the process. Because clearly I disagree with his process and with the reasoning behind these star ratings, and I find it very, very inconsistent. And therefore, I also find it frustrating that he is the one dominant voice when it comes to wrestling criticism. What I'm saying is, like I said in the intro of this video, wrestling criticism is broken. Give me something to break. Just give me something to break. So the crazy thing about wrestling that we all love is that it's treated like a sport, but it secretly isn't. And it may share similarities with sport, but again, it's secretly not one. And because wrestling isn't a sport, it means that we don't necessarily have to agree that modern wrestlers are better than they've ever been in the past, despite obvious advancements in diet, technology, sports science, and all that kind of stuff. But because, as I've now mentioned, wrestling criticism is so narrow and so concentrated at the top level with Meltzer, his assertion that modern wrestling is better than it ever has been has become like a central pillar of wrestling criticism, and I don't think it's necessarily true in the slightest. And I've seen this idea challenged by people. I've seen it challenged by people who are maybe even fans of Meltzer's. I've certainly seen it challenged by those who usually oppose him more often than not. But I've never seen it challenged by somebody who has a similar stature to Meltzer's, a similarly loud voice. And that's partly because there's really not that many people, there's not that many people with Meltzer's stature. I'm not. Why are you looking at me? I'm tiny compared to Dave. And I'm not just talking about the size of our forearms. Yeah, he's a strong boy. Anyway, so, despite mimicking a sport, as I've said, wrestling is not a sport. But what it certainly is an art form. And debate, I think, will always rage over how highbrow or lowbrow an art form wrestling truly is. But I still think it definitely is an art form. It involves performance, it involves an audience, and it involves storytelling. And yet, other art forms are spoken about so differently by their critics. You don't hear a music critic arguing that across genres, pound for pound, modern music is 100% definitely better than it was in like the late 60s, for example. And you won't hear a serious music critic say things like, you know, well, obviously music's better now because the world is more open than it ever has been and there's been technological advancements and more people have access to the resources that would help them teach themselves an instrument or musical theory or what. No, that's just not an argument made. There might be more good music out there than there was in the olden days because of this greater accessibility of the modern world, but I don't think you could say that it's all like way better. There's just more good music if you look for it. What I'm saying is I think music probably has a higher floor than in the past, but not necessarily a higher ceiling. Same with cinema. Like no film critics argue that, you know, modern film is way better than it ever was in the past. Of course, there are some glittering modern examples because gems can be found everywhere across its history, but they're not saying like, well, the technology's better now, so film is better. Art forms don't work like that. There can be certain periods of time or certain little scenes throughout the history of an art form that particular critics find particularly amazing. Of course they can. In terms of these kind of peaks in wrestling history, of course, many examples that a lot of people would agree on would be All Japan in the 90s, New Japan in the 2010s, like Ring of Honor or Noah in the 2000s, and so on. So when Meltzer argues that wrestling is better now than it ever has been, I think what he instead is trying to say is that wrestlers now are better athletes than they have been in the past. On the whole, like your average wrestler now can do way more advanced things than your average wrestler could back in the day. That is true. I agree with that. A lot of modern wrestlers do absolutely jaw-dropping things athletically that would have blown people's minds back then. Can you imagine like an Ospreay versus Ricochet match back in the 70s? People would have thought it was witchcraft. This, by the way, I believe is also Meltzer's argument for breaking his own 5-star scale so regularly in the modern age. Because modern wrestling in his mind is so much better now than he could have even imagined it being back when he started doing his ratings in the 80s, then he has to award more than 5 stars. That appears to be his thought process, I believe. But just because somebody's a more impressive athlete than ever before, and just because they can do more impressive things with more regularity than ever before, that doesn't necessarily mean that a wrestling match is going to be better. Get ready, because it's about that time where I shoehorn in a certain man from Chicago. Neon light, Nobel Prize when the leaders be... No, there is a real reason for me bringing him up, I swear. So the other match I'm bringing up, as kind of an equivalent to Hogan versus Rock back at WrestleMania 18, is CM Punk versus Samoa Joe at All In London, the first time they went to Wembley Stadium, AEW that is, in 2023. And this was quite an unusual match, wasn't it? It definitely stood out on an AEW card of all things, with AEW pay-per-views typically being these big maximalist events where the athleticism is insane and the work rate is off the charts. But Punk vs. Joe, which opened the main portion of the card, was kind of old school by comparison. They kind of slowed things down, they played to the crowd a lot, they included a lot of taunting and posturing and one-upmanship, even a bit of comedy. I remember one particular moment as well where Punk was too wise to fall for Samoa Joe's typical walkaway spot. Joe's walkaway spot where his opponent goes for a high flying move and Joe's got it scouted and casually walks out of the way. Well, Punk thought that he had this scouted and then held up on doing the high flying move, only to shortly afterwards fall for it in an even bigger way with a dive to the outside, which Joe, of course, casually walked away from. And it was moments like that, not just like the big finish of the match or whatever, or the blood from CM Punk. It was moments like that, I think, the character stuff as well, that I think made this match really, really enjoyable. I thought it was pretty great. Meltzer gave it 3.5 stars. I don't think it's quite as bitterly remembered a star rating as Rock and Hogan's 3 stars, but for many people, we still kind of remember it, especially because I was kind of too young to really know about star ratings when Rock and Hogan happened, and I didn't have that to hold on to. So this has kind of become my little version of Rock versus Hogan. Oh, that's very pathetic. So once again, let's examine why Dave didn't like this match as much as most other people seem to. Again, I think there's various possible reasons, one of which being, I think he may have been comparing it to Punk versus Joe of the past. Now, in their prime, when they were younger men, Punk and Joe had those sort of clashes that you would typically expect Meltzer to love. Joe in particular had that super work rate ability in the ring, appearing indeed as he did in 3 of those previously mentioned 7 5-star matches across the whole decade of the 2000s. And one of those 5-star matches was against CM Punk. It was the second match of their famous Ring of Honor trilogy. That trilogy featured these epic length matches that built upon the previous one each time, telling this very gradually unfolding and very complex story with all these different layers and themes. The match at Wembley was very different to that trilogy, of course. And I think that only makes sense. Punk and Joe had slowed down physically. They were about 20 years older. But it wasn't just a more simple match in terms of the physical work rate. I think it was also a far more simple match in terms of the story it told. And there are reasons they did that. And there are reasons I think that it proved to be a smart move as well. For one, it was in front of a stadium crowd, whereas the matches in their trilogy were in front of smaller audiences, and I think that allowed more room for these little intricacies, little quieter moments in the match. Whereas in the Wembley one, everything had to be bigger and more obvious, I suppose. And also, it was one of just 11 matches on the night, and in AEW at the time, in that landscape, it was never going to have as much time and attention dedicated to it as they did back then. I mean, that 5-star match, the second one in their trilogy, that was part of a show literally titled Joe vs. Punk 2. It was named after the match. That's how central it was to that show. Now, Punk's one of my favourite wrestlers of all time. I've made no secret of that, of course. But Joe's up there as well, to be fair. But Punk's where my point is made here, right? So Punk has admitted freely in the past that compared to other great wrestlers, he's not really that good an athlete. I believe I've seen a clip of him comparing himself to Colt Cabana, back when they were friends, basically saying, Colt's the jock and I've got lead in my ass. Colt's the athlete and Punk's the nerd, but he pays attention to detail and there's all these other strengths of his. Because despite not being, in his mind, an elite level athlete, despite not having the agility of a gymnast or the explosiveness of a college football player or the grappling skills of somebody like Kurt Angle, for example, despite not having any of those attributes, Punk was still able to become, in the eyes of many, including myself, a an all-time great wrestler. And why is that? There's various reasons, I think. First of all, and perhaps most obviously, there's his legendary mic skills. But there's also his creativity, his ability to convey compelling stories, both in individual matches and over the course of a longer feud. There's the way he structures his matches, his versatility, the way he works well with opponents as varied as Samoa Joe, Undertaker, Cena, Jeff Hardy, Chris Hero, Austin Aries, MJF, and so on and so on. And I think that all of these things can contribute to making somebody a great wrestler just as much as like athletic ability or strength or agility or acrobatics or whatever. Now, also, right, because you might think that I'm dismissing Meltzer and saying, well, obviously Meltzer doesn't realize that though. But the weird thing is, Meltzer does realize that if you listen to him talk. How many times have we heard Dave Meltzer talk about the historic, the mythical status of El Santo, or the legendary, the terrifying nature of Bruiser Brody in his prime? These kind of things that aren't necessarily to do with work rate as we know it, but still contribute to somebody's greatness. But weirdly, even though Meltzer clearly on some level agrees with the argument I've just put forward about CM Punk, Meltzer doesn't seem to take that too much into account when he's doing his star ratings. Kind of goes back to what I said about Meltzer being wrestling's biggest historian and biggest reporter, but also its biggest critic, and how those things don't mesh that seamlessly. And in my view, it seems like to Dave Meltzer, a big thing he associates with how good a match is how much impressive stuff is in it. And I don't just mean like one particular type of impressive stuff. I know a lot of people think that Meltzer's particularly in love with like indie spot festy, PWG flippy stuff. I don't even think it's limited to just that. I think Meltzer's also very likely, perhaps even more likely, to really rate highly a slower paced, more epic length main event clash, provided of course that in its runtime it has enough jaw-dropping moments and visually impressive, again, stuff. And I think that in kind of centering his ratings, or appearing to, around stuff and how much impressive stuff is in a match, I think that's quite limiting, especially once again, as like wrestling's one undisputed top critic. You can have any kind of 5-star match you want, as long as it's one that has lots of impressive stuff. Therefore, I believe, and I think it's quite evident in the ratings usually as well, I believe that a shorter match is far less likely to get a 5-star rating from Dave Meltzer, because of course a shorter runtime means less chances to cram in impressive stuff. Regardless, by the way, of how well that short match achieves its goal. If there's not as much to it, it's not going to get as meaty a rating. But again, is a long movie necessarily better than a shorter one of similar quality? No. Or a longer album. You know what I'm saying. Punk vs. Joe at Wembley Stadium went 14 minutes. Not the shortest match or anything, but perhaps slightly shorter than we would typically expect a Meltzer 5-star match to be. Similarly, because as I've mentioned, Punk and Joe tailored this match to be a bit slower, and they were playing to the back row, and there were less incredible feats of athleticism or these jaw-dropping sequences, I believe that also may have contributed to its relatively low rating compared to the general consensus. This also links back to Hogan versus Rock, a match that drew such a positive reaction, not for what they were doing in the match, but how they were doing it and what it meant. It certainly feels like Meltzer doesn't have much of a varied view in terms of what form a great match can take. It's not as limited as some people would suggest, but I don't think it's that varied either. In other words, it feels like there are way more types of matches that can't be classics to Dave Meltzer than matches that can be. And Rock versus Hogan and Punk versus Joe at Wembley don't really tick many of his boxes. And I think I fundamentally disagree with that. I think that a great wrestling match can take a lot of different forms. Just like a great film can be a comedy or a psychological thriller or an action movie or whatever. Like one of my favourite films of all time is The Grand Budapest Hotel. I love it. I think it's amazing. 5 stars from me. I also think that Apocalypse Now is a 5-star movie. I also think that School of Rock is a 5-star movie. Back to wrestling, one of my favourite matches ever is Okada Omega 1 at Wrestle Kingdom 11, this big, complex, deep, epic main event singles match. But I also love, for example, The Rock versus Brock Lesnar at SummerSlam 2002, much shorter, more concise and visceral and one-sided. I also love, for example, Will Ospreay and Ricochet's very divisive clash in the Best of the Super Juniors, the one that kind of tore the fabric of the wrestling world apart with people arguing over, was it too choreographed? What are they doing? Are they doing too many flips? I like that match too. I love the very straightforward morality play of Bayley versus Sasha Banks in NXT, but I also love the really dark and quite gross match between Vampiro and Pentagon in Lucha Underground. Great wrestling matches can take so many different forms. And again, it's not that apparent necessarily because, as I've mentioned, wrestling criticism is so narrow, is so top-heavy, is so dominated by just one voice in particular. And the crazy thing is, now that I think about it, I don't even think that I have wide enough parameters. Like, I'll explain what I mean. I love when I read a review of a wrestling match that I don't necessarily agree with, but one that makes me think about it in a different way. You know, it makes me reconsider why that match was better than I thought it was. Because even if I don't necessarily agree still after reading it, it's made me reconsider things and take something forwards with me when I watch the next wrestling match. I think that's again why it's so important that wrestling criticism needs to have as many high-level voices as possible giving these match ratings, giving these show reviews, because at the moment, once again, it's kind of in the dinosaur age, guys. I've already pointed out that I don't think that's Meltzer's fault, you know. And even if these alternative voices were more prominent, just given how messy and toxic online modern wrestling discourse is, I still think we would just see Meltzer's takes dominate the most. Because his points of view are the ones that we most commonly see regurgitated and shared and often mocked as well. But it's always Meltzer's takes. Meltzer himself, I believe, has said, an argument along the lines of, I'm just one person with an opinion. And of course that's right. But for whatever reason, people really cling to the fact that his ratings mean so much, whether you agree with them wholly or whether you disagree with them as well. Maybe again, it's because he is also wrestling's biggest reporter, He's a huge voice in the space. In fact, you probably see Meltzer's journalism these days raise kind of issues and raise a lot of debate more than his match ratings. The match ratings still do, of course, but I think the journalism maybe more so. And speaking of journalism, sneaking around, sniffing out clues, sneaking around, oh, I'm sniffing out clues. I've made up this song, it isn't a real song. So I went back and I looked at Meltzer's reasoning at the time, like in 2002, for only awarding Hogan vs. Rock 3 stars. In the issue of The Observer from the week of WrestleMania 18, Meltzer talks about the match twice. Of course, he does what many of you will be familiar with. He does like a kind of a match review that's more of a recap, really. Talks about what actually happens in a wrestling match, like a blow-by-blow account, and then the star rating follows it. There's one of those for Hogan vs. Rock, of course. But he also talks about the match at the start of the newsletter too, in far more loose and kind of opinion-based terms. Now, if you're familiar with the structure of the Wrestling Observer newsletter, you'll know that Meltzer does this when a match happens to also be the biggest news of that particular week, because the top of the newsletter is dominated by the biggest story. And of course, when Rock versus Hogan happened, that was also the biggest story of that week. So like he'll mention it at the start, and then later on in the newsletter, we get, the actual review of WrestleMania 18 with all of the matches in order, and that's one of them. And that first part, away from the general review of the show, but the bit at the top of the newsletter, that's the part where I found something very interesting. Because Meltzer describes Rock versus Hogan like this, and I quote, "It was the match where Hogan was to so-called pass the torch to The Rock in storyline, but in reality, he cleverly took the torch from The Rock in a manner Rock himself didn't even understand until after the show was over." That's a very loaded thing to say, isn't it? And I think it goes back once again to the issue I have with Meltzer not only being wrestling's biggest reporter and historian, but also its biggest critic. Because what Meltzer's written there is his opinion presented as fact, which would be fine if it was in the review part of the thing, because that's basically what a review is. It's the writer's opinion presented as fact. But that paragraph isn't from the general review of the show. That's from the bit at the top of the newsletter. That's from the news reporty part. But again, it's presented to us as fact. Also, if we look at what Meltzer's saying there, Hogan cleverly took the torch from The Rock in a manner that Rock himself didn't even understand, I think we might find a secret bonus reason why Meltzer didn't particularly care for the match that much. Because maybe he didn't like what was going on behind the scenes at the time. It certainly sounds that way. And there's stuff to back my theory up there, by the way, in the latter part as well, in the match recap itself, where Meltzer says, "Hogan made a lot of Rock's offense look bad by not going up for him. Some wrestlers thought this was Hogan's cleverness, others blamed it on his injury, but even bringing up the injury, it was noted that when it suited him, Hogan got up just fine." Basically, Meltzer there saying that a lot of people were accusing Hogan of sandbagging The Rock in the match to make Rock look bad. Later on, he says, Rock used the rock bottom and Hogan again made it look bad by not going up for it. First of all, I watched the match back, right? I think Hogan takes a total of 3 rock bottoms in the match, I believe. And every single time, although he's not flinging himself into the air like a young Shelton Benjamin, I think it's quite telling that I couldn't tell which particular one Meltzer was talking about. He's kind of going up for it about as much as you'd expect a nearly 50-year-old Hulk Hogan to go up for the rock bottom, which isn't that much, but I don't think it looks particularly destructive or malicious. But that could just be my point of view. I'm not even necessarily disagreeing with Meltzer here. He could well be right overall. This could well have been what Hulk Hogan was trying to do. We know what a master politician he had the reputation of being behind the scenes over the course of his career. Of course we do. Specifically, we know how ruthless Hogan could be at positioning himself to look the best possible, often at the expense of others. But the part that I actually disagree with there in what Meltzer's saying is the part where he implies that it had like an impact on the match or on how The Rock was perceived, because I don't think it impacts the match much at all, which I still think is an absolute triumph. And I can't say with absolute certainty that Meltzer, also feels like it impacted the match, but you look at his overall rating, 3 stars, and it feels like he thinks it did. Anyway, on the topic of, stuff going on behind the scenes of a match, there's one thing obviously that I didn't mention about that Punk versus Joe match at Wembley. Whereas here, Meltzer is theorising that Hogan versus Rock may have had some weird stuff going on behind the scenes. We all know for a fact that Punk versus Joe did have some very weird background context. 100%. Oh my oh, like Tarzan boy, hide and seek, away up in... Yeah, there was a lot of stuff going on between AEW roster members at the time, CM Punk, and Jack Perry. If you somehow don't know, but I mean, how could you not know? Basically, Punk had a real-life physical confrontation backstage at the Wembley show, like right before his match, with Jack Perry. So basically, Jack Perry had been wrestling on the kickoff show and threw a barb at CM Punk down the camera itself. And then when he came backstage, Punk and he got into it a little bit. There was a bit of pushing and shoving, a bit of physical confrontation, which was broken up. And this confrontation, which looked like it was started by Punk, eventually led to him being fired. Now this physical confrontation between Punk and Perry obviously didn't tell the whole story. It was simply the boiling point of tensions that have been going on for a long time behind the scenes in AEW between CM Punk's camp and the Elite's camp, the Young Bucks' camp, which obviously included Jack Perry. The year before the Wembley show had seen Punk's infamous rant, of course, at the All Out 2022 press conference, a reported backstage brawl, and a subsequent breakdown in communications between the two sides where, honestly, nobody really came out of it looking good. But everybody still somehow made it to Wembley 2023, and that is where this tipping point happened. On the pre-show, Perry had a no DQ match with the wrestler Hook, which revolved around the use of a car windshield at one point. Perry looked into the camera, as I mentioned, and said his now infamous phrase, "Real glass, go cry me a river." And this was a reference to a previous argument the pair had had over the use of glass in a televised segment, which had been leaked to the wrestling media, and then that's why after the match was over, Punk and Perry had their now infamous backstage altercation, security footage of which was later controversially aired by AEW on AEW Dynamite. That's a recap for anybody. Most of us will be well versed in this story by now. Honestly, the fact that Punk vs. Joe even went ahead after this incident is remarkable in itself. And the fact that most people found it really enjoyable is even crazier. Let's see what Meltzer says about the match then. So again, like the Hogan Rock match, in the Observer newsletter following the Wembley show, there is a match review in the actual show bit, the recappy bit of the newsletter further down, but there's also, of course, a lot of stuff nearer the top of the newsletter on the backstage galactic beef. And of course, because this newsletter came out far before AEW had broadcast CCTV footage of the incident, anybody who wasn't physically there in the vicinity of the confrontation at the time it happened didn't really have any idea what had gone on. But news came out fast, like during the show itself. I remember being sat in Wembley Stadium, looking at my phone and being like, wait, Punk had a fight backstage? But he just wrestled his match. What? It came out quick. And honestly, as a bit of journalism, I think Meltzer does a pretty good job in this Observer, covering all the angles. He gives points of view from Punk's camp, he gives points of view from Jack Perry's camp. It's a really, really fascinating issue of the newsletter to look back on. But where I think the issue arises is in the later bit, the review of the match itself, which does not closely follow Dave Meltzer's usual model of just kind of doing a blow-by-blow recap of the big moments in the match and the big spots. I'll read it word for word. It's very different. The match report is this. Punk came out and a lot of fans were singing his song while others were booing him. The crowd was mixed early on, got way more for Joe as the match went on, but when Punk won, the crowd popped like he was the face and cheered Punk a lot. Another story is that before the show started, a story going around was that Punk was insistent that Justin Roberts not announce his match. Whether this was Roberts being on his Christopher Daniels list, or he pushed for the idea that the Collision ring announcer, Dasha Gonzalez, should do collision-based matches. Gonzalez also did House of Black versus the Acclaimed and Billy Gunn later on, is not known. There was a lot of stuff to that Punk story, wasn't there? I forgot about a lot of that. But that's what Meltzer said so far. Anyway, he goes on. Punk did some Terry Funk rope spots. He botched a Hurricane Rana, and that gave the crowd a chance to boo him a lot. When Punk blocked the Hurricane Rana and Joe threw Punk into the barricade, Joe got a big pop. Punk bled. Punk did John Cena spots, and Joe did Hulk Hogan spots. Punk later used the spinning toe hold to honor Terry Funk. Joe looked really good here. Punk won with the Pepsi Plunge, his Ring of Honor finisher from nearly 20 years ago. 3.5 stars. And again, I'm not saying that 3.5 stars is particularly a low match rating, but in Meltzer terms, by his usual standards, 3.5 out of 5 for the opening bout of a massive stadium show in a match that most people seem to really enjoy between two veteran, all-time talents, which he's also given 5 stars to in the past. It feels so low. Anyway, my main point is, like, in that paragraph that I read, I think over half of it isn't about the match. It's just extra details of the backstage drama that he'd covered earlier on in the newsletter. Basically what I'm saying is, I don't think it feels like Meltzer can really separate himself. Again, it's the problem with wrestling's biggest reporter and biggest critic being the same person. Now we have to talk about a word that we all love throwing around online. Bias. First of all, I'd just like to say, I hate when somebody uses that as a term in an argument against somebody and thinks that, I've got you, you're biased, and I've caught you being biased. Yeah, when we're talking about an art form, everybody's biased. Like I said at the top of the video, art is subjective, and we all have our own opinions. We all have our own biases. We all have our favourite wrestlers, and we all have our favourite things that we think make for good wrestling. I myself am biased. Of course I am. I have the things that I think are good in wrestling, and when those things happen, I think that is good you know what I'm saying? But then, when you are extra close to the business, like Dave Meltzer is, I think you cannot help but develop an extra layer of bias, like an unconscious bias. When you're that close to the thing you're critiquing, you will naturally like some people and want them to do well, and you will naturally dislike some people and want them to do maybe not as well. And I'm the same. I may not be as closely involved with the industry as I used to be about 10 years ago. Wow. But in that time, of course, I will have developed unconscious biases of my own. And while I really, really try to think about it and try and put anything aside when I'm talking about why I enjoyed or did not enjoy a particular match or show, you can't avoid all of that. That's why it's an unconscious bias. And honestly, apart from the performers themselves and promoters and stuff, who out there with a platform as big as Meltzer's is as close to the wrestling business as him? Nobody. But am I saying this means that Meltzer has been compromised and we should discard all of his opinions immediately? No, of course not. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is this is just another reason why wrestling criticism is broken and why we need to look further afield and take more opinions into account and have a more vibrant, varied critical landscape. Video kill radio. In my mind and in my car. Again, I don't want this to be a Meltzer hit piece. And the parts of this video where I've been particularly criticizing his criticism, they are only part of what I feel is the problem. The state of wrestling criticism isn't Meltzer's fault. But I think that because people arrange themselves either so for or so against him, it's just kind of exacerbated the problem with everything. And I think the situation requires a lot more nuance than that when it comes to Meltzer himself as well, by the way. Because I think that there have been plenty of times when a Meltzer match rating or his thoughts on a match have completely matched my own. But there have been occasions when, of course, I've completely disagreed with him. And that should be the case for everyone. Everybody should agree with other people at times and disagree with, if we're being honest about our own opinions. That is the nature of criticism, and that is the nature of a subjective art form like pro wrestling. And I think if there was a bigger platform out there for more talented writers and critics, then I think maybe wrestling would at least become a little bit of a more considered and thoughtful place when it came to its critical thinking. Then again, it's kind of hard when the vibe out there is so poisonous at the minute, isn't it? Like when you're trying to critically engage with a particular match or a particular show online, you are far less likely to run into a thoughtful, nuanced take than you are to run into one of those brain-dead takes out there. You know, the ones like, it doesn't matter if you like it or not, it made money, you absolute mark. Or ones like, if you don't like it, don't watch. Or my personal favourite, why can't we just enjoy everything and shut up? Hey, maybe that could be my next video essay, actually. Like the absolute state of wrestling discourse in the modern age. Oh, no, I don't think I want to do that one. But anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, thank you very much for watching, and do leave a like and a share and all that kind of good stuff in the comments down below where your opinions can live. And yeah, once again, thank you for watching. I've been Jack the Jobber. Click subscribe if you haven't already. And sorry, Dave Meltzer, please don't beat me up with your massive arms.